So, for the last couple of chapters, we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, regulation of energy, metabolism, growth. And so, I wanted to start with chapter 6, which we kind of skipped over early in the beginning of the semester, covers the endocrine system. And I'm going to bring in some of chapter 6 before we get into chapter 21. So, let's start with just reviewing the endocrine organs. Hopefully, you remember from anatomy, we have several. In the brain, you have the pineal gland, produces melatonin, and that's for the sleep cycle. Then you have the hypothalamus, which controls the output of the pituitary. Really, the anterior pituitary. So that's one. Two, the hypothalamus has direct control over the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine. So this is really a sympathetic nervous system component. And then the third thing, if we're looking at the hypothalamus, is it produces two hormones. One is antidiuretic hormone, and the second is oxytocin. So the hypothalamus produces antidiuretic hormone. We went through this in chapter 18. Oxytocin has to do with contractions of the smooth muscle of the uterus during labor and delivery. But really, the hypothalamus controlling the output of the anterior pituitary and really controlling the adrenal medulla to secrete what we would call adrenaline or epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those are really two biggies there in the brain. Then we have the thyroid. Thyroid gland produces T3 and T4. These are your metabolic hormones. And just like it sounds, this controls cellular respiration rates in the cells. So are you using ATP or using ATP? Are you creating ATP using glucose, using triglycerides? This hormone is increasing the transfer of energy from triglycerides and glucose to ATP or not. On the backside of the thyroid gland, you have parathyroid. This is controlling levels of blood calcium. Thymus, we're not going to talk too much about, but this is really a lymphatic tissue producing T cell lymphocytes. So yes, your endocrine and immune system are tied in. But the adrenal gland, you have two of them. They are on top of the kidneys. And again, the insider medulla is the epinephrine, norepinephrine. The cortex, a big one is cortisol. Another one is aldosterone, which we also covered in chapter 18. Then we also have the pancreas. For endocrine, it secretes insulin and glucagon. Insulin's the big one. Insulin gets secreted when blood glucose levels go up. Glucagon when blood glucose levels go down. Of course, we have ovaries, testes. Those are the producing estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. As it pertains, though, to metabolism, we're going to kind of focus on digestion and metabolism. We control our body, these endocrine glands control the rate of hormone secretion. So rate would be how much is secreted over time, rate. The amount, right? How much is bound to plasma proteins in the blood, and how much or how fast it's being broken down is hormone metabolism. So mechanisms of hormone action. Hormones have a target cell that they are going to bind to a receptor, cause something to happen. And one of those things that can happen is alter the plasma membrane permeability. So a good example of this is insulin. Insulin is a hormone that increases the permeability, the ability for glucose to go into the cell. So that's a great example of altering plasma membrane permeability. Stimulate synthesis of protein. This could be something like growth hormone, which is going to stimulate protein synthesis. It can also a third way that hormones can affect target cells. They can alter the cellular activity, activate or deactivate enzymes. Good example of this would be thyroid hormones, right? To increase or decrease rate of cellular respiration. Induced secretory activity can cause something to be secreted, like thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to cause the thyroid gland to secrete T3, T4. And then also stimulate mitosis. That is basically creating new cells. New cells. So growth hormone. So those are all the ways that hormones can affect their target organ. Hormones can be released through neural input. This would be hypothalamus. Directly causes epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released from adrenal medulla. That's the inside of the adrenal gland. It can cause hormones to be released, like a negative feedback. Example of this, hypothalamus does thyroid releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. That causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid gland and which releases T3, T4 into the blood. And T3, T4 is going to increase cellular respiration, it's going to increase body temperature, and this is going to then shut off thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So that would be the negative feedback. Is that when you have that hormone cause eventually to reestablish homeostasis or what you wanted to happen, it'll turn off the original hormone from being releasing. So it'll stop this loop. Some hormones are just being secreted and then not secreted on a circadian rhythm. So the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus and also the pineal gland to secrete melatonin throughout the day until about 1 a.m. Then it stops secreting melatonin until it starts up again midday. So that would be circadian rhythms. So neural control of hormone release from the hypothalamus. Here is the example. So you have some stressful event. Neural signals, hypothalamus. Oh my God, this is so stressful. It can cause the hypothalamus to release epinephrine, norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Can also stimulate the hypothalamus to release corticotropic releasing hormone, which targets the anterior pituitary, to then increase adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. So depending on the type of stress, you can have cortisol released and you can have epinephrine, norepinephrine released. Examples of humoral would be blood glucose levels go up. Beta cells have receptors that are monitoring blood glucose levels. So when they go up, the beta cells release insulin into the blood. Insulin goes to the cells and increases the permeability of glucose by inserting GLUT4 channels to facilitate glucose going into the cell. Into the cells and out of the blood. Therefore, blood glucose levels go back down. Here's the thing about insulin. Insulin is a hormone that promotes storage. So it wants to store that glucose into your body cells. So if you have an increase in the amount of glucose or sugar in your blood, insulin's going to be released based the amount of insulin is released based on the amount of increase in your blood glucose levels. And all of that blood glucose is meant to be stored. That's what insulin does. Now, if your cells don't need the glucose right now for cellular respiration, it's still going to store it. Insulin's going to promote the storage of glucose into your fat stores. So it is a storage hormone. Another example is when blood potassium levels go up. Aldosterone is a hormone of the adrenal cortex that is going to have you secrete potassium into your urine filtrate. So in chapter 18, we talked about the kidneys and urine filtrate. And here, aldosterone increases the excretion, meaning you get rid of potassium out of the body via urine. Aldosterone also, though, increases sodium reabsorption. So you keep more sodium in the body. So aldosterone increases sodium reabsorption. We didn't talk about it a lot, but it does increase potassium excretion, so you can lower your potassium levels back. Here are the endocrine organs, the really kind of ones we went through. You have the hypothalamus, you have the anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary with antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Talked about the pineal, didn't really talk about thymosin, but it's aimed at boosting your lymphatic system. Thyroid, increased basal metabolic rate, cellular respiration. Increase cellular respiration. And then it gets parathyroid, adrenal gland. You're going to have the adrenal cortex and the medulla. So this is controlled by hypothalamus. They're actually both controlled by the hypothalamus. It's just these right here is controlled by hypothalamus, which then controls the anterior pituitary, which then controls the adrenal cortex to release these hormones. So it gets a little more complicated. Pancreas Didn't mean to do that. Pancreas is insulin and glucagon, somatostatin. We're really focusing mostly on insulin. Most people don't have a problem with low blood sugar, which is what glucagon helps to restore back to normal levels. So we transport hormones in our blood from endocrine, endo being inside. If they're hydrophilic and so they're polar molecules that love water, then they can just cruise around dissolved in the plasma. If they're hydrophobic, they're nonpolar molecules, they have to be bound to a carrier protein. So these are nonpolar fat-based, and they include steroid and thyroid hormones. So you have T3 or T4. It has to have a protein crust around it. So proteins have to encircle it so it can live in a aqueous environment, meaning your plasma of your blood. And these tend to stick around longer. So they have a longer half-life. They don't get broken down as quickly. Rate, and that comes to rate of hormone metabolism. It's like how quickly do those hormones get broken down, or how long are they staying in your blood? And so lipophilic, meaning nonpolar hormones, can be stored in fat tissue or adipose tissue. And so they can stick around a little bit longer. Hormone levels are generally kept in balance, but when glands are secreting too much or too little, then we have an endocrine disease or syndrome. And that is what we call pathology. Pathology is abnormal physiology. Something's not doing what it's supposed to correctly in your body. So hyposecretion means too little hormone is being secreted. An example of that is type 1 diabetes. So the beta cells of the pancreas no longer secrete insulin. You can have hypersecretion where there's too much hormone being secreted. Too much growth hormone, you're going to get acromegaly. Bones are going to grow taller than they should, muscles, but also facial features, jaw, forehead. So there's going to be an abnormal look to the skeletal structure. That's secreting too much, too little. You can also have pathology when there's abnormal tissue response. So there's normal hormone levels, but the tissues are responding inappropriately. And this is an example of this is type 2 diabetes. So the beta cells are secreting insulin, but it no longer helps increase glucose permeability, right? So no GLUT4 channels inserted in the membrane. I'm getting sloppy. Sorry, guys. So this is a problem just like hyposecretion, but it's different, right? Because hyposecretion, that's type 1, those cells no longer produce insulin and secrete it. Type 2 is a abnormal tissue response where insulin is binding to the receptor on the cells, but it's not bringing those GLUT4 protein channels to the cell membrane. So permeability is not increased for glucose. Glucose can't make it into the cell. Both result in an increase in blood glucose levels in the blood and a decrease in glucose levels within the cells. This just kind of showing you where the hypothalamus is in the brain. If you remember, this is the thalamus or thalamic nuclei. And then below the two thalamic nuclei, you have the hypothalamus. There's a little infundibulum or connection to the pituitary gland right beneath it. And when you look at the hypothalamus here, so this would be the hypothalamus. You can see the supraoptic nucleus secreting oxytocin and the paraventricular nucleus secreting antidiuretic hormone. They're producing it here. And then they send the neurotransmitters, essentially they're neurohormones, into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland and then into the bloodstream. And so oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone make it into the bloodstream that way. And it tells you what antidiuretic hormone does and oxytocin. The hypothalamic pituitary portal system is really this portal system where, and it's in the anterior lobe, but the hypothalamus is secreting either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones into the first or primary capillary bed, which that capillary bed goes down into the anterior pituitary gland via a portal vein. So that capillary bed merges to become a vein. And these releasing or inhibiting hormones are called tropic hormones. So these hypothalamic tropic hormones from the hypothalamus get into the anterior pituitary via the portal vein. And these tropic hormones are going to cause the anterior pituitary to secrete what they're being told to by the hypothalamus. So the anterior pituitary tropic hormones enter the bloodstream in a secondary capillary bed, which then becomes a new portal vein and into the bloodstream that go to the distant endocrine glands or target organs of that hormone. And so when we look at it, we have tropic hormones being created in the hypothalamus, being sent into this capillary bed, which becomes a portal vein. They all merge to a portal vein, which becomes a second capillary bed, in which the anterior pituitary cells, endocrine cells, are secreting into the next portal vein that then goes into your bloodstream. And so this is kind of showing you the anterior pituitary gland adrenocorticotropic hormone. It targets the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone targets the thyroid gland. Growth hormone targets the liver, but bones, muscles, and tissues. Prolactin, the mammillary glands. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, reproductive organs. And melanocyte stimulating hormone. Then we get into the posterior pituitary, antidiuretic, and oxytocin. Good to review these. The tropic hormones are going to be releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. We get down to the pancreas. The pancreas is what secretes insulin and glucagon. And the role of insulin, it's peptide hormone, it's polar. It's secreted from the beta cells. So sometimes it looks like this, beta cells, of the islets of Langerhans or pancreatic islets. Depending on your book. And it promotes energy storage molecules. It's an anabolic hormone, meaning it stores energy, um, basically taking single molecules, nutrient molecules that were absorbed from the small intestines into the blood and then stores as either glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscles or fat, basically triglycerides in adipocytes, which is fat cells. So it's storing. It's going to put it in the cells or it's going to put it in the fat cells. Promotes glucose uptake. So during the absorptive state after you've eaten, a meal, that's meal. Insulin secretion, depending on the food you eat. We're going to do the blood glucose lab. And depending on the food you eat, you may or may not have a lot of insulin secreted. If it's got a lot of sugar in what you ate or drank, then insulin's going to be secreted. If it's proteins, probably not so much insulin secreted. But after you're breaking down the food that you ate and you're in the absorptive state, that is when insulin will be secreted if you have high amounts of glucose entering your plasma or blood. Insulin also helps amino acids be stored and then, built into protein structures. It also is activated by the parasympathetic system when you're resting and digesting. Resting. Now, insulin secretion is going to decrease during post-absorptive, so haven't eaten in a while, and you're having to use energy reserves. And what does that mean? Energy reserves, either glycogen in the liver or skeletal muscle, or triglycerides in fat cells. So you're going to call upon that stored nutrients. And this is where the sympathetic nervous system is kind of utilizing stored energy. Looking at the anatomy of the pancreas, you have alpha cells. This is the islet, we'll just call it pancreatic. Islets. And you're going to have your alpha cells, which secrete glucagon. You're going to have your beta cells, which secrete insulin. You have delta cells secrete somatostatin. And then on the outside, you have the exocrine. And we talked about this in chapter 20. This is for digestion of nutrients. And so the beta cells, if there's an increase in blood glucose levels, then you're going to have an increase of insulin secretion from the beta cells. It, in most tissues, causes the increase in glucose uptake into the cell. It also increases amino acid uptake to build proteins, and it keeps proteins from being broken down. In adipocytes, it's going to increase fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis and decrease the breakdown of fats, which is lipolysis. In muscles, it's going to increase glycogen storage and decrease glycogen breakdown. So lysis means breakdown. So if it's lipolysis, it's breakdown of fats. If it's glycogenolysis, it's breakdown of glycogen. In the liver, so it's decreasing that. In the liver, it's going to increase fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis. So increase fat creation, could be from extra glucose, and it's going to decrease making new glucose, which is gluconeogenesis. What's the action of glucose on insulin secretion? There are monitors monitoring blood glucose levels. When those blood glucose levels go up in the blood, that glucose is converted. It's coming on in, this GLUT2 coming in. Glycolysis is occurring. ATP is being produced through oxidative phosphorylation. And that ATP is going to close potassium channels. So the first thing that happens is you have high blood glucose. It's coming into the cell through GLUT2 channels, not GLUT4, but GLUT2, because this is the beta cell of the pancreas. And that glucose coming in is going to be oxidative phosphorylized to produce ATP. ATP is going to cause potassium channels to close, which, as you know, is going to cause depolarization. Why? Why depolarization? Because you have an increase in potassium staying in the cell, right? So it's becoming more positive after that channel closes. And now you have depolarization, which opens voltage-gated calcium channels. This should be sounding familiar. So again, going through it, high glucose levels come into the cell. Glucose is converted to pyruvate, then goes through Krebs cycle oxidative phosphorylation, produces ATP, which closes the potassium channels. Now you have depolarization, an increase in the positivity inside the cell, change in voltage because it's getting more positive, voltage-gated calcium channels open, calcium comes into the cell. Now, just like all things, calcium is going to cause the exocytosis. Let me spell it correctly. Of, you guessed it, insulin. And somehow that didn't, well, I guess here, secretion of insulin. So if you look at this, beta cells depolarize with less potassium moving out. That causes calcium, voltage-gated calcium channels to open, which causes exocytosis of insulin. And so that's how insulin then gets into the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, insulin's going to go to receptors on cell membranes. That's where on your everyday run-of-the-mill cell, GLUT4 transporters or protein channels are going to insert into the plasma membrane and facilitate glucose going into the cell. When blood levels of insulin decrease and insulin receptors are no longer occupied, these GLUT4 transporters are recycled back into the cytoplasm of the cells. So not available for glucose permeability. These don't work, so ignore those. So actions of insulin, anabolism. This is, remember, building molecules. So either glycogen synthesis or triglyceride synthesis, which is fat synthesis. and this is really in the liver. Promotes glucose uptake by the cells, decreases catabolism or breakdown of energy. Glucagon, on the other hand, it's a hormone that targets the liver, also made by the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets. And it goes to the liver and promotes glycogenolysis, which is breakdown of glycogen. So this is stored glycogen in the liver, and or increasing the synthesis of new glucose from lactic acid, amino acids. It also stimulates the breakdown of stored fats. So lipolysis is breakdown of stored fats. And modulation of glucose effects after a high protein, low carbohydrate meal. This can affect glucagon being released. Glucagon secretion is increased in the post-absorptive state. So post-absorptive, when haven't eaten in a while. And it decreases during absorptive state, which is right after a meal. So it's going to decrease with an increase in plasma glucose. Really what glucagon does is mobilizes energy stores, right? It takes it out of storage. Takes glucose and triglycerides out of, quote, storage for cellular use, right? So cellular respiration. Or if you don't have glucose available, it can synthesize new glucose via gluconeogenesis, and this occurs in the liver. And this is where you take amino acids and convert them into a kind of a version of glucose. So alpha cells of the pancreas increase glucagon secretion, and it's going to cause an increase in the breakdown of stored glycogen, which is stored glucose. It's going to decrease glycogen synthesis for obvious reasons. It's going to create more new glucose or keto acids from amino acids if glucose isn't available. It's going to increase protein breakdown. So you have amino acids for ketone synthesis, and it's going to decrease the building of proteins. This is why when you're working out, you don't want to be in a post-absorptive state where you have glucagon being secreted, because you're trying to work out to build up your muscles, but you're breaking them down at the same time because you need some kind of stored glucose. It also is going to cause lipolysis, which is the breakdown of stored fats. And it's going to decrease building of stored fats. So normal glucose levels can be anywhere from 70 to 110, depending on what you ate. When and what you eat. If it goes above 140 milligrams per deciliter, that's considered hyperglycemic. If it goes below 60, it's hypoglycemic. And these blood glucose levels are primarily maintained by either the secretion of insulin or the secretion of glucagon. And so regulation of plasma glucose concentrations kind of look like this. If it goes up, beta cells secrete insulin. If you don't have diabetes, then glucose is going to be taken into most of your cells. You're going to store that glucose as glycogen in your liver and skeletal muscles. And you're going to stop the breakdown of glycogen. You're also going to not produce new glucose in the liver, so no gluconeogenesis, and this lowers plasma glucose levels back to normal. So you stop secreting insulin, right? So stop secreting insulin. On the other side, if you're haven't eaten in a really long time, so you're going to exercise on an empty stomach, the alpha cells are going to secrete glucagon because you need stored glycogen to be released. You need new glucose to be created. You need to break down stored fats, which is lipolysis, and increase those fatty acids. And so you're breaking down proteins and you're using your energy stores, which is not optimal if you're going to be exercising 2-3 days in a row and you want to feel decent. When there is a homeostatic imbalance in insulin, we term, well, really, when there's a homeostatic imbalance of blood glucose levels, it's diabetes mellitus. And so you can have too much secretion, or you can have hypoactivity, like we talked about in the beginning. So this would be type 2. It's referred to as, I can't think of the term right now, but so hyposecretion is type 1 and hypoactivity is type 2. We went through this with chapter 18, polyuria, huge urine output because you're so much sugar, so much glucose is in the blood. It's exceeding the transport maximum for reabsorption into the proximal, from the proximal convoluted tubule into the peritubular capillary. So this glucose that is above the transport maximum stays in the urine filtrate. Water stays with it. So you have a huge urine output, but water is leaving your body. And so your hypothalamus is telling you to drink. Because you're peeing out a lot of your liquid and you want to maintain your blood volume. And then polyphagia is excessive hunger and food consumption because your cells don't think you have any energy. Because glucose is not making it into the cells. If you have too much insulin being secreted, so hyper insulinism, that's excessive insulin secretion, you're going to have hypoglycemia and disorientation. I've never seen this, but I'm not a practicing physician, so who knows? Diabetes mellitus. Energy metabolism is impaired. Why? You're not getting glucose into cells. No glucose into cells for cellular respiration. Thus, decrease in ATP available to the cell. And so hyperglycemia is the primary sign because you're eating carbohydrates, it's getting broken down into glucose, it's entering your bloodstream. You have a lot of glucose in your bloodstream and it can't make it into the cells. So you're going to have a lot of that sugar in your blood. Decrease in insulin. I think this is talking about hyperglycemia, yeah. And the acute effects of diabetes mellitus is hyperglycemia, dry mouth, you're thirsty, increased frequency of urination. Those are first things. If this goes on for a long time, then severe symptoms where you have hypotension, which is low blood pressure. Why? Because your blood volume has decreased, which decreases blood pressure. Headaches, low blood volume, fatigue, low energy. blurred vision, difficulty thinking. Again, neurons can only generate ATP with glucose as a substrate. Therefore, you have to have glucose for those neurons to be working. So what do you do if you don't have any glucose getting into your cells? Well, you're trying to use your fat. So glucose is unavailable. You can use lipolysis. So breakdown of stored lipids to triglycerides, which then through beta oxidation, you're going to make some keto acids. You can also use amino acids via protein breakdown. And you end up with a lot of these keto acids. And if you get too acidic, you have a drop in pH, it's called ketoacidosis. So you start seeing ketones spilling over into the urine, which leads to more dehydration because water follows ketones, and you're going to have your electrolytes imbalanced. And this can lead to diabetic coma. So treatment, well, inject insulin into blood. This is usually type 1 diabetics. If type 2 diabetes goes for long enough, then at some point after blood sugars are out of control for a long time, it can lead to injecting insulin. Rehydration with fluid and electrolytes is a definite must. And bicarbonate due to ketoacidosis, right? So that's a drop in pH, and therefore you need to increase pH with bicarbonate, some kind of bicarbonate. If these things aren't done with regularity, the heart can start having issues. Like I said, you can have a diabetic coma or death. It doesn't sound very good. Chronic complications. If it's the early stages, you just have an increase in urine production and hyperglycemia. Hyperglycemia comes with a whole host of damage to arteries, cardiovascular system, and we'll talk about this in the blood glucose lab. Also, increase in the thirst, polydipsia. Why? Caused by dehydration and a decrease in blood volume because we have constant urine production or we're losing blood volume. And then polyphagia, you have an increase in hunger. No, you're never the satiety centers of the hypothalamus. Don't tell brain you've eaten. So you just keep thinking you're hungry. So diabetes mellitus, decrease in insulin activity or insulin resistance on the level of the cells. And that's going to lead to an increase in plasma or blood glucose. That's going to increase the filtered load of glucose. That's going to increase the osmotic pressure and glomerular filtration rate. You're going to excrete more water. You're going to decrease blood volume, which decreases blood pressure or mean arterial pressure. That's going to stimulate the release of angiotensin 2, which is going to increase aldosterone secretion to increase sodium reabsorption and increase potassium excretion. So here's where the electrolytes get messed up. And also, aldosterone increases total peripheral resistance, which increases blood pressure back up. Also in the hypothalamus where your thirst centers are, it's going to tell you to drink more. So thirst centers go up. In the hypothalamus, you also have your satiety centers that are telling you we need energy, even though you're storing energy, but you still feel like you have to eat all the time. Last, I'm going to talk about thyroid, since it's our metabolic hormone. T3, T4, it's thyroxine is T4, and then triiodothyronine. This is the most common. They do the same thing. They both regulate metabolism or cellular respiration rate in cell. Also, calcitonin regulates blood calcium levels. In the thyroid synthesizes thyroid hormones ahead of time. And so it's located in these colloidal cells. You need to have iodine in order to release T3, T4 out of thyroid cells into the blood. So that's where iodized salt or iodine comes in. We need that iodine to release the T3, T4. So you have T3, T4 in here, and it's just waiting to be released. So again, thyroid stimulating hormone from the hypothalamus. Well, let me do that's the tropic hormone. So let's do this. Hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone to anterior pituitary. Then anterior pituitary gland releases thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes in the blood, attaches to a thyroid stimulating hormone receptor, which is a second messenger system, causes cyclical AMP to start producing protein kinase, which that protein kinase triggers the production and release of T3, T4. And if you have iodine, causes the release of that T3, T4 into the blood vessel. Thyroxine is most common. It's a long negative loop feedback. T3, not as much, more active at target tissues. T4 can be converted to T3 when needed. Totally above your pay grade in this class, but again, hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone. It targets the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which then causes the thyroid to release T3, T4. Now, T4 is what is that negative feedback loop on stopping thyroid releasing hormone, which stops thyroid stimulating hormone. T3, T4, once secreted into the plasma, again, T4 can be converted to T3 if needed. Actions of thyroid hormones, they are lipophilic like steroid. They can stay a little bit longer. They have a longer half-life. And the calorogenic effect, this is, basically cellular respiration. It increases the rate of the sodium potassium pump, increases use of ATP there. It can increase the number and size of the mitochondria, increases ATP production. Increases oxidative phosphorylation, again, increases ATP production. Enhances the breakdown of stored glycogen and stored lipids, promotes new glucose or gluconeogenesis and ketone synthesis, and promotes the synthesis of beta adrenergic receptors for adrenaline. Glucocorticoids, these are from the adrenal cortex. Same system, hypothalamus releases corticotropic releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which goes into the blood and targets the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And this is influenced by circadian rhythms. Are you getting enough sleep? And by stress. And so cortisol has kind of been called the stress hormone because any kind of increase in stress or decrease in sleep, or both, can cause cortico-releasing hormone to cause adrenocorticotropic hormone to cause the adrenal gland to release cortisol. What cortisol does is mobilize stored energy, but it also suppresses the immune system. And that is why we say over time, cortisol being released long term is not a great thing because it is also weakening your immune system. So you have an increase in cortical secretion, you have an increase in sympathetic activity, epinephrine, antidiuretic hormone, angiotensin. This is affecting blood pressure going up, and it keeps that blood pressure high. The effects of abnormal glucocorticoid secretion. So Cushing's syndrome is where you have too much cortisol released. And that's going to lead to hyperglycemia because you're constantly releasing energy, i.e. glucose. And you're going to have protein depletion because your body thinks you need more glucose. So it's going to break down your muscles and proteins. Addison disease is hypo, so too little or not enough. And so you have hypoglycemia, poor tolerance to stress, excessive sodium retention, and potassium secretions cause arrhythmia in the heart, right? Not a good thing. So this kind of showing you the adrenal medulla. This is where epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the adrenal cortex. This is cortisol here, and aldosterone are in that cortex. Hormones of the adrenal gland. Aldosterone's kind of the big one we talk about in physio, and then cortisol is also a big one. There's also androgens. They regulate reproductive function, and we're not getting into that too much in this class. But these go through, this is really a good summary of the metabolic effects of hormones discussed in this chapter. So this is metabolic effects. So it goes through insulin, primary stimulus, net effect on carbohydrate metabolism, net effect on plasma levels, net effect on lipid metabolism, and net effect on protein metabolism. So how does insulin affect carbohydrate, lipid, and protein metabolism? It increases it. Glucagon does the opposite. It's going to break it down. So remember, lysis is breaking down, where genesis is creating new. Then you have epinephrine, norepinephrine, breaking down lipids, increasing plasma glucose, increase protein synthesis, T3, T4, increased glycolysis, increased lipolysis, increased protein synthesis, and then cortisol, decrease in glucose uptake, increase in plasma glucose, increase in plasma lipids. So increase in blood glucose levels, whether you need it or not, and triglyceride levels. Also breaks down proteins. So not a great thing to have a bunch of cortisol streaming through your body all the time. Also another reason why it's good to eat before you work out, because cortisol does get released if you don't have enough fuel on board when you start working out. And so you end up breaking down proteins and having all of the stores depleted right in the beginning of the workout, and it's not a great thing. All right, that's it.